Welcome to CounterPoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. We have under 2 weeks until the election on September 20th. And as summer winds down and back to school is now behind us, many of us are turning our attention to the federal election campaign well underway. And can you avoid it? TV news footage and newspaper reports speak of a lot of anger seen on the campaign trail. We've seen anger from voters, from protesters, and from politicians. And there has been new policy announcement and, in some cases, flip-flops. So just how will this all boil down for the election? What impact, if any, will any of this week's announcements have on the campaign trail? Well, later in the program, I'll be joined by an election panel with Elliot Hughes, Senior Advisor with Summa Strategies, and David Clement, North American Affairs Manager from the Consumer Choice Center. But now to tell us what's happening in the polls, to give us the latest and the greatest, we welcome Quito Maggi, President and CEO of Main Street Research. Thank you, Quito, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
Okay, so what do we need to know? Has there been any shift nationally in the polls?
Yeah, very little, I guess. This last week, we did see a tightening up. The Conservatives in our polls, at least, now hold about a 2-point lead. As of our latest number, 33.5 for the Conservatives, about 31.5 for the Liberals, and just shy of 19.8 for the NDP. PPC continues to sort of, really outperform in terms of where I thought they would be, and they're about 6.5 in our polls. Not sure if that's going to hold until election day or not. These debates are coming up, both the French and then the English one in the next day or two, and those should have an impact.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. In your experience, I mean, you have many, many years as a pollster under your belt. Do you actually feel that the debates do impact the polling?
Well, not so much. It really depends. I mean, we saw last week with the TVA debate in Quebec, didn't really move a lot of votes in Quebec. Everybody sort of performed relatively well. People thought that both Trudeau and Monsieur Blanchet sort of won. But it didn't really move a lot of votes, and it didn't lose a lot of votes for either Jagmeet Singh or Aaron O'Toole in Quebec. So the question is, the answer to your question is maybe. Sometimes it's very rare that you have sort of that knockout blow that really moves the needle. But yes, we look at the debates and as the pivotal event in the writ period.
And I know the next morning there's always some declaration, oh, this person won, that person won. Of course, every campaign says they win. But the headlines in the papers, I think, do sometimes shift public opinion. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's not the event so much that really moves the needle. It's the coverage of that event. And what I mean by that is exactly what you said. The next day, the headlines, the pundits all talk about certain things. And whichever narrative sort of dominates that on who won and what the consensus is, usually the coverage does then end up moving the needle. It turns into these water cooler conversations, right. and that is what tends to move the needle in that last weekend before the vote. And that's really the impact of the debate, not the event, the coverage of it.
Now, what surprises are you seeing still? Like, do we have regional surprises as to who's performing better than expected? You mentioned the PPC is higher than you would have anticipated. Is that going to make a big dent in perhaps the Conservatives' attempt to form a minority government?
Yeah, it could. I mean, if in our polls, they're in double digits throughout the prairies and in Alberta. The PPC didn't really expect to see that, had thought more that the Maverick Party might be more of a threat,
right,
on the right flank of the Conservatives. But if you add up the Conservative vote and the PPC, it's at 40%. It's kind of unheard of. When in the Harper 2011 majority, they got 39.3 with no divided right. So to have them at 40%, but I guess I just wonder what turnout is going to be like. There's no real... Other than the PPC, there's no real surprises anywhere. We've seen some big shifts in some of the regions, and now everything has started to stabilize as people are coming home. They're more focused on the election. We're not seeing those big major shifts anymore. I expect, the only surprise really is that there's going to be a minority government of one stripe or another. I think a majority at this point is out of the question for anyone.
Wow. Okay. Well, we're going to have to stay tuned to that. Thank you so much again for joining me and giving us this information.
Thanks again, Tanya.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Elliot Hughes, Senior Advisor with Summa Strategies and former advisor to Liberal Finance and Defense Ministers. And we have David Clement, North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Centre and former research assistant to the Canada Research Chair in International Human Rights. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining me. Lots happening this week. And I think the things that's dominating the headlines are these protests that we see at Prime Minister Trudeau's campaign events. It's a lot of heat. Prime Minister Trudeau is calling these folks the anti-vaxxer mob. I watched the footage. There's a lot of swearing. I know we touched upon this with last week's panel. He was even at one point pelted with gravel, which is atrocious. But what do you like? Where do we even start with this? I have never seen anything like this in Canada. Elliot, what are your thoughts?
Well, tensions are very high right now, it seems, on the campaign trail around vaccines, vaccine mandates, and so on. And, what we're seeing, the kind of protests we're seeing against Justin Trudeau, I think have stepped over the line in some cases. Look, everyone agrees that there's a right to protest, and that's an important part of our democracy, and the ability to do that is important to sort of what we stand for as a society. But there does come a point where it's sort of gone beyond, and I think that's where we find ourselves now with some of the pieces against Trudeau. I think what's interesting is Aaron O'Toole finds himself in a little bit of a rock and a hard place here. He has come out and said these protests, are beyond the pale appropriately. The challenge is frankly, some of the supporters of sort of the anti-mask, anti-vaccine are some of those conservative voters that he's trying to get, and he's being squeezed by the PPC, and you've seen a rise in their polling numbers the last couple of days. Those are, I think you can probably make the assumption, directly moving from the Conservatives to the PPC. So he finds himself in a very difficult place here.
Now, can we actually say that these people are anti-mask, anti-vaccine? Like, I've listened to some of the chants. People, I watch on Twitter the footage from raw footage, and I listen to what people are saying. And you have, obviously, expletives. I'm not going to repeat those, obviously. But then you have people yelling. And I think this is important because I want to know what people are actually complaining about. And they say, no two-tier state. We don't want a two-tier system. And obviously, they're talking about the vaccine mandates, the vaccine passports. Mm-hmm. Are these people really, these alleged anti-vaxxers, are these really conservative-leaning voters? David, what do you think?
Yeah, so I would say that, there are certainly a good portion of them who would be probably deserving of that title of anti-vaxxer. It is a very useful way to dismiss the entire audience at once. Politically, I can understand why Trudeau would use that term, just because it very easily dismisses whatever their concerns are. I don't necessarily share their concerns, and I think that the way in which some of these protests have been atrocious. I think the real question for me that has left me scratching my head is, why is he not better protected? He's the prime minister of this country. I can't understand whether that's a decision made on the campaign trail. I think back to when Harper was facing real threats, and he had, I believe it was former or ex-military personnel who were acting as his bodyguards. Obviously, the threats against Trudeau are real. And so I think beyond the partisanship of this election, there's a serious question about the safety of the prime minister. And I think a lot has to be done to ensure that he is safe, regardless of whether you agree with him or not.
Right. No, and that's a fair point. I think it must be challenging. And, I've been campaigning as a politician, attempted politician myself. You want to be with the people. This is your time where you're supposed to be, shaking people's hands and kissing babies. Obviously, COVID, not as much of that, but you're supposed to be going and meeting the people where they are. If you have a wall of security around you, how do you achieve that? So, we don't have to go into the intricacies of campaign detail and whatnot, but there is a practical element. I agree with you that it is our prime minister. He should be better protected, but pebbles, they threw pebbles at the guy. It was horrible.
I mean, a very simple solution here would just be to find whoever it was and arrest them and charge them with the appropriate crime. And the same goes for the person who egged Maxime Bernier. That type of stuff, although the level of violence there is certainly not the same, those people deserve to be charged and punished for the crimes that they've committed. That would certainly go a long way in terms of sending a message that, hey, you can't just pick up a rock and throw it at the prime minister, let alone anybody. So that would probably help. Whether or not that happens, I'm not sure. Well, we haven't seen that really progress yet. Yeah,
assault is assault. So it doesn't matter who it comes down to, whether it's the prime minister or common man. That really needs to be dealt with. We're going to pick up this discussion right when we return from this commercial break. We're discussing what's going on in the federal election and all the new issues that have arisen. We talked about the very aggressive mobs at some of the debates, or rather some of the campaign events. A lot of this seems to be stemmed from a concern about vaccine mandates. And obviously we've seen the rhetoric ramp up concerning vaccine mandates. You know, Justin Trudeau on the campaign trail last week was saying, you know, he doesn't want to have somebody beside an unvaxxed person on a train, something to that effect. There's some people accuse him of ramping up language against vaxxers. But then you have Aaron O'Toole, who just this weekend said he wants to introduce a vaccine certificate system. So one should assume that he would have the equal kind of aggression at these kinds of events. With this is really, I think, becoming a wedge issue potentially. Elliot, is this the wedge issue that people anticipated would be for this election?
Well, it's funny. It started that way at the beginning of the campaign and then went a bit quiet, and then I now think has come roaring back. It's a very easy line to draw in the sand. Are you for vaccine mandates and pushing vaccines and making it mandatory to have a vaccine to get into a restaurant or a movie theater or a bar, or are you not? And for Canadians, the choice, I think, is settled. Most Canadians, the large majority of Canadians, believe that it is the right thing to ask for have a mandated vaccine. So politically, what that means is the Prime Minister is hugging the vaccine mandate issue. And I would say in some ways, maybe sure gently exploiting it to his advantage, which is what you do in campaigns.
Exactly.
And that's putting Aaron O'Toole in a very difficult position because amongst his base, he's going to have a hard time, because of his base, I should say, he's going to have a hard time embracing the idea. That makes it very challenging for him to come out with a clear message. And we're seeing him being challenged on this. We're seeing him being challenged on guns. We're seeing him be challenged on a number of issues where he's kind of trying to have it both ways.
Right.
He had it a little bit during the leadership campaign when he became Conservative leader, and now he's running with a bit of a broader, bigger, bluer tent. But those things are coming back to haunt him. And I think the vaccine mandate debate is going to be one of those issues we're going to have to watch for the rest of the way.
Yeah, and we're going to probably watch about in the debates, and we'll get to that in a moment.
Yep.
David, is this going to come back and haunt Aaron O'Toole?
I think it will. I think it will, because regardless of whether the mandate is a good idea or a bad idea, the polling shows that Canadians support it. That's fairly intuitive when you consider the percentage of Canadians who are vaccinated.
Yes, but not everybody vaccinated supports a vaccine mandate. I've seen a lot of research suggesting that a lot of people are pro-vax, but not necessarily pro-mandate.
Mm-hmm. Certainly not. There are some exceptions, but the trend lines correlate pretty well. And so you have an easy opportunity to create a wedge issue here and say, this is what I support. This is what the people support. Are you on the side of the people? And Elliot does raise some good party-based issues in terms of where someone who's maybe vaccine hesitant lies on the political spectrum. Although I think it's a little more varied based on some of the research that I've seen and what I've seen anecdotally in my own life and some of the polling. But generally speaking, I think that holds true. And so it is a question for Aaron O'Toole. Is he willing to plant his flag on some sort of middle ground now? He's certainly not going to go the direction of Maxime Bernier. Or is he going to just follow Justin Trudeau? And then the question is there an electoral advantage to getting there late? I'd argue there probably isn't.
If I could just jump in,
Please.
Campaigns aren't great with nuance. So it's not a time to be hedging, humming and hawing about your position. Well, it's because of this, and thinking about that. It's black or white. You have to be clear in your communication. You have to be able to make it very clear to the voter on where you stand on X, Y, and Z issue. And that's that. And there has been too many of those issues where the conservative leader is humming and hawing, is on this way, and then he's moving in this way, and he's changing his policy. He's got something in his, on the campaign booklet, and it's too much. It's too complicated for voters. You need to be very clear on where you stand. And I think that's one of the big things that is dogging the conservative campaign and will dog them for the rest of the campaign until election day. And
this is really the O'Toole paradox, because Aaron O'Toole, when he first entered politics, was very much a red Tory, however you define that.
Right.
He ran as kind of a true blue, much more conservative Tory, and is now more towards who he was in the early stages of his political career. And when you don't have the ability to explain nuance to voters, because you have to get your point across in 30 seconds to get a headline, it becomes very difficult to explain that. And now he's stuck trying to walk across that balance beam.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion with our election panel. We've got Elliot Hughes and David Clement joining us. I want to talk about the surprise. I thought this was a surprise, was the Aaron O'Toole firearms flip-flop. So I think I count two now. We had the flip-flop with the conscience rights for doctors, and now it seems there's a firearms flip-flop. So just to give you a little context here, when we had our convention in the early spring, I guess, or late winter, one of the party platforms, one of the policies passed was that they were going to repeal the order in council, which banned all sorts of firearms, especially ones that look like semi-automatic firearms and whatnot. Now that is in the policy book, or was in the policy book, and then Aaron O'Toole announced that, in fact, he's going to keep that order in council in place, probably upsetting a lot of the firearms rights folks. And then there was a footnote added into the policy book. And Elliot, why don't you chime in here? It's confusing to me.
I mean, it's confusing to people who follow this day in, day out. Imagine what it's like to voters who are just tuning in from the outside and, have been busy all summer and taking their kids back to school, and they're sort of wondering themselves, like, what is this guy talking about? This is the firearm issue is almost beside the point at this point in the conversation. It's more about, is Aaron O'Toole the kind of leader who's going to continually flip-flop on big issues and go back on his word if he's pushed in one direction or another by some group? And you can extrapolate this, whether it's firearms, whether it's, the right to choose, whether it's healthcare. You can go on and on and on and list those out if you're the Liberals, and you can exploit that. And frankly, I think the Liberals should, because you need to test leadership during elections. That's what elections are all about. And Canadians need to ask themselves, do they want a leader who's going to flip-flop back and forth on an issue depending on the last person you spoke with? Or is it something that is core? He knows what he would like, and he knows what he believes in, and he's going to say that. And there's no filter there. And that's fundamentally, I think, the challenge that Aaron O'Toole is going to be facing these next couple of weeks. It will be particularly stark on Wednesday and Thursday during the debates.
I agree with your assessment there. I'm not sure if Justin Trudeau fits the mold of someone who's going to say something and do it. I find it interesting that this is the wedge issue that seems to be working. And that's mostly because now this is the nuance point. If you look at rates of gun crime, gun crime increased 9% from 2018 to 2019. So regardless of what increased 9%. So regardless of whether or not the Liberal plan is the right thing to do, whatever they're doing certainly isn't working in terms of stamping out gun crime. And I agree with you that you look for that level of consistency, but I'm not really sure that's the point that the Liberals need to hammer home here, given the fact that in 2015, this was supposed to be the last election that was first past the post. So much so that they appointed a cabinet minister to oversee the process and never did it. And so from my point of view, yes, O'Toole is hypocritical on this and flip-flopping. But for the Liberals to use this as a talking point feels a lot like the pot calling the kettle black.
Okay, well, when I think of this issue, I feel like this is pandering, obviously, to the urban voters. I mean, handguns are banned pretty much in Canada. You cannot transport a handgun loosely. That's a restricted firearm. I live in rural Ontario. We hunt. We're in a hunting community. This kind of legislation, the Order in Council, and we don't need to get into it because we're not here to really get into the actual meat and potatoes of the issue, but it impacts the rural Canadians or those in the territories who, for them, firearms are important. So I think this was an interesting flip-flop because I think this is part of the Conservative base that I think might come back and bite Aaron O'Toole very soon. We have debates. We have 30 seconds left. We have debates this week. We had the TVA one last week. Now we have another French debate, followed by the English-speaking debate later this week. What can we expect? We have 20 seconds. David, any surprises? Are you expecting anything?
I'm expecting there will be quite a dogpile on Aaron O'Toole. What the outcome will be, I can't say. I am very disappointed that foreign policy is not on the table, given what is unfolding in Afghanistan and the mess that is. But yeah, I certainly expect the other party leaders to pile on Aaron O'Toole.
Elliot, 10 seconds. In the last words?
I expect it to be a bit of a slugfest and a stark contrast being drawn between all parties as they make that final pitch to voters.
Okay, thank you both for joining me. Appreciate it. I guess we'll see if the debates make any difference. For CounterPoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.